Ladies and gentlemen, my friends, thank you for gathering here today to explore and understand one of the most significant and controversial diplomatic developments of recent years. The Trump-Israel deal. What lies beneath the headlines, beyond the photo? Ops, our motives, consequences, and the complexities that shape its legacy. Every deal in history carries a story. But the Trump-Israel deal carried a transformation. That it wasn't merely a political agreement. It was a statement that altered decades of Middle Eastern diplomacy and global balance. For more than 70 years, the region was defined by division, distrust, and distance between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Attempts at peace were often driven by ideals and negotiations that ended in disappointment. Then came a moment that didn't follow the old rules. Donald Trump approached diplomacy not as a politician bound by tradition, but as a businessman seeking results. The deal that emerged wasn't born from sentiment. It was born from strategy, leverage, and timing. This agreement shattered the long-held assumption that peace in the Middle East could only happen after solving the Palestinian issue. Instead of waiting for complete resolution, the Trump administration found a different door to walk through. Economic opportunity, shared security, and a collective concern over Iran's growing influence. It was a masterstroke of timing. Arab nations like the UAE and Bahrain saw an opening to normalize relations with Israel, gaining both U.S. favor and access to Israeli technology, intelligence, and defense systems. Trump positioned himself as the broker of a new Middle East. And for a moment, it appeared he had achieved what many global leaders only dreamed of. But beyond the celebrations and handshakes, the real brilliance of the deal lay in how it redefined diplomacy itself. For decades, international agreements were wrapped in moral language, words like peace, unity, and brotherhood. Trump's deal stripped away the poetry and replaced it with business logic. It was transactional, transparent, and unapologetically strategic. Each party walked away with something tangible. Israel gained regional legitimacy and the suspension of potential annexations that could have triggered backlash. Arab nations gained access to economic growth, military cooperation, and political leverage in Washington. And Trump, in turn, gained a legacy, defining foreign policy victory to showcase his order of the deal philosophy on the global stage. However, every move in geopolitics creates ripples far beyond its surface. While some hailed it as a step toward modern peace, others saw it as peace without justice. Critics argued that it bypassed the heart of the Middle Eastern struggle, the plight of the Palestinians. Yet, even in that critique lies an undeniable truth. This deal broke the inertia that had paralyzed diplomacy for decades. It replaced the waiting game with action, even if imperfect. It proved that nations, when driven by interests rather than ideology, could find common ground where none seemed possible before. The Trump-Israel deal, therefore, was more than an alliance. It was a psychological turning point. It showed that sometimes history doesn't wait for everyone to agree. It moves with those who dare to act. The real story behind it wasn't about peace achieved overnight, but about an old map being redrawn by unconventional hands. It demonstrated that power, timing, and vision, when aligned, can rewrite even the oldest chapters of conflict. When the Trump-Israel deal was announced, it was celebrated across capitals as a breakthrough for peace. But beneath the applause lay a deeper truth. It wasn't really about peace. It was about partnership. This agreement was not the end of conflict. It was the beginning of cooperation built on shared interests. For decades, peace in the Middle East was defined as the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Every roadmap, every summit, and every handshake circled around that goal. But this deal shifted the definition. Instead of chasing peace through endless negotiations, it redefined peace as progress, economic growth, technological exchange, and regional stability. It reframed the narrative from one of reconciliation to one of opportunity. Trump's approach was pragmatic. He recognized that the old methods of dialogue had exhausted their potential. The Arab nations, particularly the UAE and Bahrain, were not driven by nostalgia or ideology. They were driven by modernization, security, and the desire to diversify their economies beyond oil. Israel, on the other hand, was eager to break its diplomatic isolation and enter new markets. Both sides realized they could gain more from partnership than from hostility. And so, peace was replaced by practicality, a formula where economic interest became the new language of diplomacy. This shift was groundbreaking because it marked a turning point in how nations define their relationships. Rather than waiting for the perfect moral alignment, countries began to act on mutual benefit. The Abraham Accords became a symbol of this new realism. Behind every photo of leaders shaking hands stood billion-dollar trade deals, defense agreements, and investments in technology, energy, and tourism. Flights opened between Tel Aviv and Abu Dhabi, and joint ventures began forming in areas once unthinkable for collaboration. It was not peace in the emotional sense, but it was progress in the pragmatic sense, a partnership that gave both sides something to protect and build upon. Yet, there was also a quiet irony. While nations celebrated newfound friendship, the conflict at the heart of the Middle East remained unresolved. The Palestinian question was not answered, it was simply bypassed. The deal didn't end occupation or bring justice. It merely worked around it. Critics argued that calling it a peace deal was misleading, because peace without inclusion is temporary. Still, even in its imperfection, the agreement revealed an uncomfortable truth about global politics. Nations move not by sentiment, but by self-interest. The Trump-Israel deal showed the world that diplomacy doesn't always come wrapped in compassion. Sometimes, it comes wrapped in contracts, investments, and shared fears. It was a partnership forged by necessity and maintained by ambition. The world saw leaders smiling, but what truly bound them was not empathy. It was economics. And yet, in this calculated alliance, a new kind of stability began to emerge. Perhaps peace in the modern world no longer means the absence of conflict, but the presence of cooperation strong enough to outweigh it. That is how peace was repackaged, as partnership that speaks the language of progress instead of promises. The genius of the Trump-Israel deal lay in its simplicity: unite against a common threat. Beneath the public narrative of friendship and normalization was a deeper, more strategic alignment shaped by fear and survival. For decades, Middle Eastern politics had been divided between ideology and rivalry. But the rise of Iran as a regional power changed the equation. Tehran's growing influence in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen was seen by many Arab states as a direct challenge to their sovereignty and stability. The United States and Israel viewed Iran's ambitions through the same lens: its nuclear program, support for militant groups, and anti-Western stance made it a shared adversary. Out of this convergence of concern came a new formula for diplomacy, one built not on trust, but on threat perception. Trump understood that uniting nations around shared fears could be as powerful as uniting them around shared dreams. His administration framed the normalization process not only as a peace effort, but as a strategic defense mechanism. By encouraging Israel and Arab nations like the UAE and Bahrain to come together, the deal quietly created an informal coalition to contain Iran's influence across the region. It was a rare instance where former rivals realized that cooperation was not just desirable, it was essential for their own security. This pragmatic understanding became the silent engine behind the Abraham Accords. Every element of the agreement was crafted with this underlying calculation. The UAE gained access to advanced U.S. weaponry, such as F-35 fighter jets, strengthening its defense posture. Israel gained diplomatic legitimacy among Arab states and a stronger regional front against Tehran. The United States, in turn, reinforced its strategic foothold without deploying new troops or entering another costly war. It was diplomacy done through deterrence, a deal that said, "Together we are stronger against what we fear most." In this sense, Trump's approach was not about resolving old grievances. It was about realigning power to prepare for new realities. Yet, what made this moment so transformative was its quiet shift in identity. Arab nations that once defined themselves by opposition to Israel began to redefine themselves by their stance against Iran. This was not just a diplomatic maneuver, it was a psychological pivot in the Arab world. Cooperation with Israel, once seen as taboo, became a form of strategic necessity. It showed that shared threats could dissolve decades of ideological walls. Still, this unity was fragile. Built on fear rather than mutual trust, while it succeeded in altering regional equations, it did not erase underlying tensions or historical resentments. The common threat might hold them together, but the absence of a shared vision could one day test that bond. Nonetheless, the simplicity of the idea, uniting around a mutual concern, proved that even in the most divided regions, strategy can overcome sentiment. The Trump-Israel deal was, at its core, a masterclass in geopolitical psychology. When dreams fail to unite nations, fears will. When the Trump-Israel deal was announced, it was celebrated as a symbol of progress, but in the midst of the global applause, one voice was left echoing in silence, the voice of Palestine. For decades, the Palestinians have stood at the heart of the Middle Eastern struggle, their aspirations defining the moral weight of peace in the region. Yet, when the Abraham Accords were signed, the Palestinian question was no longer at the table. The very people whose homeland lies at the center of the conflict found themselves pushed to the margins of diplomacy. It was a peace process that talked about peace, but forgot those living without it. The Trump administration's approach was unapologetically pragmatic. Its goal was not to solve old conflicts, but to forge new alliances. That strategy achieved results, but at a cost: the emotional and political exclusion of the Palestinian people. For many Arab nations, the deal represented progress and modernization. For Palestinians, it felt like betrayal. They had long believed that normalization between Israel and the Arab world would only happen after their independence was secured. Instead, the deal inverted that order. Countries began forming partnerships with Israel while Palestine remained under occupation. This shift was not only diplomatic, it was psychological. It sent a message that global priorities had changed and that power, not principle, would now guide peace. For Palestinians, this was more than political disappointment. It was a blow to their dignity. Generations have lived with promises from the international community that justice would one day come through negotiations and recognition. Those promises now seem to fade into the background of global strategy. The world moved forward, and they were left behind. Their struggle was reframed as an obstacle to progress rather than a call for justice. In every headline about normalization, their silence grew louder. This silence, however, carried the deepest truth. The deal might have redrawn borders of diplomacy, but it did not heal the human wounds of displacement, statelessness, and loss. Still, even in exclusion, the Palestinian cause did not disappear. It became a shadow beneath every new alliance. A reminder that peace built on partial inclusion can never be complete. True peace demands not just agreements among the powerful, but recognition of those who suffer the most. The Trump-Israel deal may have succeeded in bringing nations together, but it left behind the very foundation of lasting peace: empathy, fairness, and balance. The forgotten voice of Palestine continues to challenge the world's conscience. No matter how many agreements are signed, the Middle East's moral question remains unresolved until that voice is heard. History has shown that silenced voices do not vanish. They echo through generations until justice finds them. The Palestinians may have been sidelined politically, but their story endures as the soul of the region's struggle. Until their inclusion becomes part of the solution, every peace will remain partial, and every deal will carry the quiet shadow of the people left out of it. Donald Trump approached diplomacy with the instincts of a businessman, not the caution of a career politician. Where others saw endless negotiation tables and ceremonial talks, he saw a deal waiting to be made. The Trump-Israel deal was not crafted through the soft language of diplomacy. It was built through the hard language of leverage. His philosophy was simple: results matter more than rituals. Every handshake, every announcement, every agreement had a transactional essence to it. He didn't hide behind diplomatic decorum. He operated with the directness of a negotiator who measures success by outcomes, not applause. This approach, while unconventional, gave him the space to move fast and break norms that had held peace processes hostage for decades. Trump treated the Middle East like a high-stakes boardroom negotiation. He understood what each side wanted and what each side feared. To Israel, he offered legitimacy and the promise of American recognition. To Arab nations like the UAE and Bahrain, he offered access to US technology, trade, and military advantage. Every signature on the Abraham Accords came with a benefit, a clear, tangible reward. It was diplomacy stripped of sentiment, built on exchange. This style unsettled traditional diplomats, but it achieved something that years of carefully worded negotiations could not visible progress. The results were undeniable. Nations that once refused to even acknowledge Israel's existence were now opening embassies, trading goods, and signing defense pacts. But this success came with complexity. Transactional diplomacy delivers quick wins, but it also risks shallow commitments. When relationships are built on mutual benefit rather than mutual understanding, they can shift as soon as the incentives fade. Trump's deals, while historic, were fragile because they relied on his personal brand of persuasion. And the political climate of the time Once leadership changes, so can priorities. Yet for Trump, the point was never to build perfect permanence, was to make movement happen now. In a region frozen by decades of diplomatic stagnation, he injected urgency and unpredictability, forcing nations to act. His critics accused him of turning global diplomacy into business deals, but that criticism was, in some ways, an admission of his effectiveness. He saw the world in terms of trade, offs, and he wasn't afraid to put a price on peace. This mindset allowed him to connect with leaders who valued power, security, and prosperity over ideology. He understood that the modern world runs on incentives, and he used that understanding to rewrite how international negotiations work. Trump's transactional diplomacy was not about kindness or ideology. It was about leverage and timing. He knew that to get results, one must create urgency, offer value, and control the narrative. While traditionalists debated, he executed, whether history remembers him as a peacemaker or a deal-maker. One truth remains: he proved that results, even imperfect ones, can redefine what diplomacy looks like in the modern age. The Trump-Israel deal may have been controversial, but it was undeniably effective in proving that pragmatism, when combined with boldness, can move the world faster than promises ever could. The Trump-Israel deal undoubtedly changed the game, but it didn't change the rules that govern the region. It opened new doors of cooperation, flights, trade, and technology exchange, yet beneath the surface, the old tensions still breathe. Nations shook hands in front of cameras, but behind those smiles remained questions of justice, occupation, and sovereignty that no deal had yet answered. The agreement brought movement, but not resolution. It built bridges over unrest, but the foundations beneath those bridges were still unstable. True peace, after all, cannot rest on transactions alone. It requires transformation, and that part remains unfinished. In the short term, the deal was a diplomatic triumph. It rebranded Israel from an isolated state into a regional partner and positioned several Arab nations as forward-looking modern powers ready to engage with the global economy. There were direct flights between Tel Aviv and Abu Dhabi, collaborations in renewable energy, defense, and technology, and promises of shared prosperity. The optics were powerful, a Middle East moving away from endless conflict toward cooperation. But peace is more than optics. It is trust, healing, and justice. The deal changed the diplomatic map, yet the emotional and human map of the region stayed fractured. The Palestinians still live under the same conditions, with the same questions unanswered. Statehood, refugees, the status of Jerusalem. Their exclusion from the agreement left a hollow space at the heart of what was being celebrated. The world saw progress, but the people closest to the conflict saw absence. A peace that forgets its central pain cannot endure. It can only pause the inevitable. The deal brought calm, but calm is not the same as reconciliation. It was a piece of politics, not of people. Even among the nations that signed, the normalization is fragile. It depends heavily on shifting geopolitical interests and on leaders willing to maintain the balance. A change in leadership, a new crisis, or a regional conflict could easily test its limits. The region's underlying disputes, territorial claims, power competition, ideological differences still operate under the same unspoken rules. What changed was how those rules were played, not what they represented. The Trump-Israel deal proved that diplomacy can accelerate progress, but cannot replace the slow work of justice. Still, It would be unfair to dismiss what was achieved. It took courage for former adversaries to speak, for decades of silence to be broken, and for nations to see opportunity where they once saw only opposition. The deal forced a stagnant region to move, even if not perfectly. It redefined what is possible when leadership dares to break old patterns. But peace, the kind that lasts, will only come when dialogue includes everyone, when security meets empathy, and when politics meets humanity. The Trump-Israel deal changed the headlines of the Middle East. But the story of real peace is still being written, waiting for the day when cooperation turns into coexistence and strategy evolves into shared understanding. The Trump-Israel deal stands as one of the most defining yet complex diplomatic moves of the 21st century. It reshaped alliances, opened new corridors of cooperation, and redefined what peace looks like in a region long dominated by conflict. Yet, beneath its success lies unfinished business. The absence of Palestinian inclusion, the persistence of old wounds, and the fragility of peace built on political convenience. It proved that power and timing can change the map, but not necessarily the mindset. The deal showed that diplomacy driven by interest can achieve results, but only diplomacy guided by justice can sustain them. True peace in the Middle East will not come from signatures or ceremonies. It will come when every voice, especially the silenced ones, is part of the conversation. Until then, the Trump-Israel deal remains not an ending, but the beginning of a larger, still unwritten story of reconciliation.